All right, well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for panel number 3. Well, there really could not be a more boring topic than digital tech regulation. So nothing to see here, there's nothing to talk about. As you all know, there's nothing going on here. In fact, I think we have 90 minutes or so to discuss this, and I actually wonder if we'll actually have time to dig into everything that's happening in tech policy and the questions that are facing regulators in this space. So we will do our best to dig into the big questions facing EU and US regulators. We will look at them through the lens of the DSA and the DMA. But first I want to spend a moment to introduce our illustrious panel. Next to me I have Beatriz, am I saying that right? Arcila? Okay. Assistant Professor of Law at Sciences Po and an affiliate with the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. To her right is Jeb Bell, who's head of research and insights at Project Liberty Institute, recently changed from foundation. Next week, so you get a preview of this change. Next to Jeb is Alyssa Cooper, who is the inaugural executive director of the Knight Georgetown Institute. And if you'd like to know what that is, you can ask Alyssa, or maybe she'll tell us when she speaks. It's a new institute at Georgetown, very exciting. Next to her is Paul Nemitz, principal advisor. Oh, no. Yeah, there you are. Principal advisor in the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. And finally, Constance Delis, Executive Director for Tech and Global Affairs Innovation Hub at the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po. So thank you all very much for being here. This is quite a panel, I think, perfect group to discuss everything that is going on here. And to briefly set the stage for our discussion, I just want to hit on a couple points. As you all know, digital platforms control the deployment of information systems and information to billions of people around the world. So we know this, and the importance of that in part is that the deployment of these systems establish our shared reality, right? Our shared sense of fact, and thereby they play this enormous role in participatory democracy. So without those shared facts, our participatory democracies begin to crumble. There also have been a large part of wiping out, at least in the US, community newspapers, which also help us hold accountable our elected officials, but also create a shared sense of facts and reality. Big tech companies have established monopolies in several markets, including digital advertising, search, operating systems, I could go on. The market cap of the 5 biggest tech companies, Microsoft's is $3.1 billion, Apple is $2.6 billion. They dwarf many countries' GDP. Other harms have become more clear. I'm sure you all know them. Mental health issues, algorithmic bias. And so regulators have stepped in. But the regulation of a borderless and mostly opaque digital space has been enormously challenging for regulators around the globe. And it's difficult, if not inadvisable, to regulate without data and evidence to do it. But the EU has taken a leading role in this space. The US has not. I'll just say that. The states, of course, have done some work in this area. The US has done a lot of work, but not regulated, per se. So the EU has led with the DSA, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act. And so the DSA in particular relates to access to data. And so despite vacuuming up the public's data, and to design and build the products that enrich them, the platforms, of course, have refused researchers and policymakers access to that very data by making it prohibitively expensive or difficult to obtain. So here we are in 2024, and I think we're at an inflection point. These rapid advances in AI have raised the stakes on all of this and amped up the timeline, moved it up much more quickly. We're in a year of global elections where 8 of the 10 most populous countries are having elections. And so today we want to dig into some of this and talk about how EU and US regulators might approach these things collectively together in cooperation. And we want to do that through the lens of the DSA and DMA. these two models of legislation. And we think there's some challenges there, there's some opportunities there that they both present. And then we want to see how those might help regulators as they tackle AI. So harmonization is very important. It's the future of digital governance, particularly in AI. It's incredibly important. It will facilitate trade, improve oversight, enable all kinds of cooperation that's important. And so I guess I'll start with Alyssa, if that's all right. Since we're looking at both challenges and opportunities here, what would you say is one of the biggest opportunities offered by, let's start with the DSA.
I was told to eat the microphone, so that's what I'm going to do. So thank you. Thanks, Michelle, for the question, and thanks to all of you for staying for our after-lunch panel. As Michelle said, I'm Alyssa Cooper, and I'm with the Knight Georgetown Institute, which is a brand new center at Georgetown University whose mission is to connect independent research with technology policy and design. So we are an institute in formulation right now. I started 2 months ago to the day in this role. And we're working very much to think about how we can synthesize research related to these questions and make it actionable, turn it into resources that policymakers and industry decision makers can use in their day-to-day work, and which obviously has a great impact on all of us because of the reach of digital platforms. I think thinking about both the DSA and the DMA, we're truly in unprecedented times here. As Michelle said, the 5 of the largest 6 companies in the world are the key targets of these regulations. They comprise trillions of dollars of value, and they're also key global platforms for speech, for connection, and for commerce. And the combination of those two things really is what puts us into an unprecedented place, is that these regulations are seeking to fundamentally alter the business practices, the technology, and the social implications of these services. And that is unlike any prior regulatory initiative that we've experienced as a society. If we compare that to what we have on the enforcement side, there's a bit of a mismatch. So obviously we have the designated enforcers. We have the European Commission. We have the digital services coordinators, we have national regulators under the framework of the DMA. But what we really need is a larger collective response to enable the enforcement of these laws. And that includes the entire research community. It includes civil society. It includes journalists. It includes independent observers. There's no way that the European Commission on its own can be the observer and the monitor and the policer of conformity to these regulations. The companies are too massive and the task is too large. And so it really needs to be a collective effort. And that's why I think the pooling of researchers and all of their efforts toward some of these objectives is so critical. There's also a lot to learn and to interrogate coming off of the backs of these regulations for the entire rest of the world. Not all of us here are EU citizens, I certainly am not, but we're all digital citizens, and these technologies have an effect worldwide on social interactions and on individual well-being. And so I do see a big opportunity in the ability to learn how do we regulate digital, which approaches work and which don't work and which need more refinement. And I think that will very much be in conversation with what is happening in the US. And we can get into more detail of this later, but some of the approaches and techniques that one might take to try to build out the enforcement regime for the DSA are very, very relevant to discussions in the US at the state level, where many, many state legislatures have already or continue to look at how do you mitigate harms to children on social media, for example. Some of those same building blocks and tools that can be useful in the DSA context might be useful to any regulator, public authority, auditor, risk assessor who exists in the US context, at the state or the federal level, and really the world over. So that's what I see as one major opportunity is while the DSA and the DMA apply within the European context, there's a lot to learn and there's a lot that we can bring into conversation with the broader imperative to regulate digital platforms.
Great, great, thank you. And I want to also just encourage the panelists to also talk to each other. You know, I'll have questions throughout, but feel free to respond to each other also. So Paul, do you have anything to add to that? Any opportunities that you see with the DSA, or you could also move into challenges or problems that you see?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation and this great initiative. Of course, I think for the European Commission and for Europe generally, it's always good if America helps. And the tradition of America helping when European democracy walks a certain way, I don't like the word regulator, it's a purely American word. The word regulator has a meaning in America it really doesn't have in Europe. We are talking here about parliamentary laws. It's not regulators who have made the rules. So the history of America helping has changed, I would say. We had a history of America being very obstructive during the Obama times, don't need to mention Trump. And now on these issues, the music has been rather positive from the government, certainly, going as far as the National Security Advisor, often, you know, saying great proposals by the European Commission. The companies, I would say, have also become, you know, a little bit less ready. Of course, the laws are still containing elements where you can really see the handwriting of very intense lobbying. But I would agree that the opportunity in the future is that those willing to help in America to make a new information environment work, which is conducive to democracy rather than undermining it, that they, of course, will be heard and must be heard in Brussels in the work of enforcement. But a world in which America doesn't give itself rules for its own corporate giants, and where the burden of making the rules which secure democracy is only on Europe, of course, is not sustainable. The political capital spent on this, you know, including fighting off the ever coming back, you know, protectionist this, protectionist that, discourse from interested circles around the world, that's no good. So I think in this discourse of transatlantic convergence on tech, we need to also include a discourse on how do we repair our democracies? How do we come back to respecting that the most noble speaking act of democracy is a law? If we want democracy to work, if we want rule of law to work, we cannot talk down the law as an innovation obstacle, as a cost factor, as a bureaucratic fantasy. We must change the discourse on what the law is about, and we must work on our constitutional settlements so that laws can be made again. I think that is the greatest deficiency of American democracy, and that's where America really is losing the leadership in democracy by its inability to pass parliamentary laws which have the legitimacy of the people. And what's happening there now, the shift to executive orders and, you know, doing things which in Europe we do under the heading of fundamental rights, for example, protection of personal data, they shifted in America to national security and say, under national security point of view, it's a problem if our data goes to China with TikTok. You know, I mean, I like it because in substance, America now does the same thing which we have been saying should be done under the heading of fundamental rights since 15 years, but under a heading which allows executive governance to some extent, and which is probably not the right heading. Yeah. So I think this issue we are facing here, and there I would absolutely agree with Alyssa, is absolutely unprecedented. I mean, for the first time in history, after radio and television regulation, where we have done, and Europe, exactly the same. We have regulated technology, so it is conducive to democracy, because we knew after the Second World War what can be done with radio for fascists. Yeah? We're doing it now a second time, And so from that point of view, it's not so revolutionary that we are regulating a technology for democracy. But this time, I think it's more dramatic and more urgent because, and that's the difference to radio and television, there are now market-based capitalistic global monopolies which control the information environment all over the world, and not only the information environment. In my book on this whole issue, I have identified the 8 elements of power which these companies control, and of course we have to see that together. It's not enough to say, oh, you know, they are controlling the networks. They have the personal data to target people. They know all our preferences. They control the networks, the undersea cables, and so on. And this concentration of power in one hand, plus one hand which is global, it's also hugely different from what we were faced with when, after the Second World War, radio and television was regulated. So it is, in the end, a challenge to solidarity. We need a solidarity of democratic lawmakers around the world to maintain democracy and the legitimacy of making democratically based rules, parliamentary rules, which ensure that democracy has a future. And the resistance and the whole tech discourse against this, you know, I think it has to be said, must be fought down by those who stand for democracy. Because this is my last sentence. Democracy is in a pincer movement between authoritarian governments and populist politics on the one hand, and an authoritarian tech discourse, a tech absolutism on the other hand, which puts technological principles of functionality above constitutional rules, such as the unity of the internet cannot be broken. Well, that means the end of democracy as we know it, if we exercise this rule to the end. So I'm very happy about this discussion, and I would say, yes, Europe must listen to America, the scientists, and this and that, and we will do it. But for God's sake, America also has to listen and wake up, and please stop this discourse, you know, we are the great innovators and you are just the bureaucrats who make the rules. Making rules is as innovative as developing a technology, and the ability to make rules defines democracy. If there's a place where no rules can be made anymore, there's a problem with democracy, solve it.
Mm-hmm. Reminds me of when I used to say privacy is the innovation. But no, so I want to touch on those comments as they relate to the DMA and whether it goes far enough, Paul. But I know Constance, I think, had a reaction to and something to say to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michelle, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation with distinguished experts. And always wonderful to be with Paul because you can never be bored on a panel with Paul. Perhaps to bounce on the 2 previous comments in terms of, because the context of our conversation is transatlantic relations. And so it's good to think about what creates tension versus alignment and coherence and comfort in the relationship. A lot has been said in terms of DSA and DMA having an extraterritorial reach, and whether that was right or wrong, and how that perhaps legitimized a reaction of defense and perhaps annoyment of the United States in reaction to DSA and DMA, but also the GDPR previously. So this is just, you know, a narrative process of us annoying them. Huh? We should be careful, perhaps. At the same time, when you take a step back and thinking about the positive effects of DSA and DMA overall in this transatlantic relation, what I find interesting is that it has the effect of creating a level playing field in terms of competition, even within the United States, because SMEs, enterprises that don't have the same means and capital than the usual GAFAM we think about, it also creates an entry point for them to penetrate the market and have more economic opportunities within their own country. So that's also something to think about on the opportunities, the positive aspects of DSA and DMA, perhaps indirect, but still on the US territory. Now, thinking about still the challenges, there's a lot to say about how all of this is going to be implemented. We can, of course, think about the fact that the implementation of these legislations in the EU will, may be different from one country to another. But even within the United States, from one state to another, there are some divergences. So that, I think, adds to the complexity overall of all of this, the implementation to follow, and that will probably give a lot of interesting subjects for research to talk and write about.
Interesting is a good word. Yeah, so just following on that idea of the DMA and, is the scope big enough, right? So Paul, you spoke about, I think you said there should be a global, sort of reaction of a democratic lawmakers should come together in this global sort of coalition to beat back the monopolies of these tech companies, to reinforce democracy. And so when you say that, I think the DMA maybe doesn't go far enough, right? Maybe it doesn't really do that, doesn't actually really defend democracy. And in fact, there has been criticism that it sort of enshrines these companies still, and it does little to actually to take them down in terms of their market shares. So I'd like to hear reactions from others to that criticism of the DMA. Maybe Beatriz, you can tell us what you think. Do you believe that about the DMA, or?
Thank you, and it's really great to be here in this panel. I'm not really a DMA person, but I can jump to the DSA and ask that question, which I think holds. I think one of the challenges that we see with these social media platforms is that, as Paul and Lisa said at the beginning, and also Constant, they're infrastructures for many of the things that we do in life. They're part of our social, economical, and democratic infrastructure, whether we like it or not. And I think it's worthwhile to try to separate those issues when we think about the regulatory instruments that we have right now in Europe. If we think about freedom and democracy, if we think about democracy in particular and freedom of speech, is what I mean, freedom of expression, I am not sure that the problem is one of monopoly and size. So I am not sure that the issue would be solved, as a bunch of scholars and policymakers have proposed before, that we would solve the issues related to polarization or the spread of hate speech, or even mental health for youth, if we were to separate social media and have more tiny social media. We actually see this in the US. We see an increasing appearance of smaller social networks. One of them is Truth Social, Trump's social network. And that one's small, and it's still quite dangerous. And so I think, or you see Snapchat, for example, which is a smaller, let's say, and very popular amongst youth. And the conversation about social media and youth should be located there, or we should be paying attention there. And that's a question kind of irrespective of size. Actually, one of the advantages of trying to be optimistic, right? One of the advantages of having maybe 4 or 5 social media platforms that are important for our democratic speech is that we can better learn about them, follow them, and regulate them, right? Like there's one entry point. This is a funny anecdote, I guess, but I'll show my point. When Gorsuch, which is a US Supreme Court, was being interviewed by Congress to be appointed, someone asked him, and this was a very strange question to ask a Supreme Court justice to be, whether he would rather fight a very big dinosaur or 100 small dinosaurs. And I don't remember his answer, but I think that for some issues, a couple of big dinosaurs might be easy than many small dinosaurs. And I think to pivot a little bit to the things that I work on, one of the challenges that we have, for example, enforcing the DSA, which is something that was mentioned before, is that there's actually quite little that we know about how these platforms work. We know a lot. We've been conducting research for a long time, But one of the challenges that our researchers have faced, and regulators as well, is that the platforms aren't necessarily very friendly to sharing data, and there have been moments of opportunity with Twitter before it was X, but a lot of the data that we've used to learn what we know about social media is data that's been scrapped, it's limited, and so on. And now we have this opportunity with the DSA to access more data, and there's a lot of challenges related there. But one of the things that we as a research community, and where we're going to have to collaborate, and I think collaborations with our colleagues in the US and across Europe is going to be very important, is creating frameworks of analysis so that we understand a little bit how does exactly Twitter work, and what are the dynamics, and how do users use them, and how does that map into, for example, different political contexts and conversations. And this would be much difficult if we had, I don't know, 100. 100 is a huge number that would still be immense platforms because the size of the things that we're talking about is massive. So, and that might be very different vis-a-vis other issues, right? Like maybe we would want each city to have its own Airbnb instead of a larger one. I don't know. But I think it's important to try to understand whether there's a problem of monopoly or not, to narrow it down to the specific issue that we're talking about.
I think you've made some really good points.
Can I follow up on that?
please.
So first of all, I just want to be on the record, I do not want to be eaten by a dinosaur. I think your comment, Beatrice, is really an important one. Is it the fact that these are large, as we colloquially refer to them, big tech, is the problem that they're monopolies? I mean, I think arguably there are problems with that. But the fundamental business model also, I think, deserves attention, and I think gets to some of the points in particular I think you were making, Paul, but also relates to the basic challenges that we face as researchers, as Alyssa and Beatrice in particular pointed out, that these are huge data collection machines collecting all kinds of data about us, not just the standard ones we bring with us wherever we go in terms of who we are, but all the things we do online become additional points of data. And then there's another layer, which is the analysis of that data. It becomes a derivative, and it's really the derivative data that drives this attention economy that sells ads. To the idea that these companies, these large companies, are where a lot of people turn for news and information and to express themselves within democracies is problematic from my point of view and from where I work, Project Liberty Institute, because I can say, because I worked at Meta briefly, the first thing that Chris Cox, one of the very senior people in the company, said to us as new employees is, we are an ad business. That's what they are. And they're not in the business of democracy. So if you rely on an ad business to be the platform for democratic participation, I think you do have some work to do to align those two things at the very least. And that's a relatively neutral statement, but I just think that's kind of like, you could start with that as a foundation. That is a problem to be solved. Democracy is something I've studied in my career, both where I am today and in previous iterations, usually from a public opinion perspective, always thinking about citizens and their rights. And one of the ways that it gets difficult to talk about democracy is it just a whole thing? How do you break it down? Well, one of the components I think is very important is accountability. And I think this is getting to some of what is important about the DSA and what it means for researchers and all of us, is that I have hopes that the DSA does change the standard and the requirements for accountability by these platforms. Because to Beatrice's point, basically we have, if you imagine the metaphor of a slice of Swiss cheese, and probably not one with a lot of holes in it, we've peered into the algorithms, we've peered into the data regimes that exist, and we don't have the whole picture, and we don't have a coherent picture that allows us to understand what's really happening. And so I'm cheating because I saw Beatrice's notes. There's known unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns. And she's borrowing that from someone, I know that. But I think that's absolutely true, Beatrice. And we need to address that. Absolutely need accountability. And so from my perspective at Project Liberty Institute, what we want to do is challenge the basic business model premise. Can we imagine a more decentralized internet where the key is data is the property, so to speak, and we can talk about what that means, of the individual, and that we move with our data and our data moves with us, and that we can imagine an internet which is interoperable, where we actually have choice as consumers, and that this becomes a domain, even in the kind of the corporate business world, of democratic choice and democratic voice. So maybe that just counts as a provocation, but I'll stop there.
I will definitely take that as a provocation. So let's imagine that this becomes a place where the US and EU agree that there's sort of a decentralized way to approach regulation online. In other words, a way to disassemble or a sort of a neutral place to regulate big tech would be to enable another kind of model, right? What do panelists think about the possibility of that being a way forward? Paul, what do you think?
I must say I'm always optimistic about American ability to innovate, and I quote Al Gore, who talked about the internet ad-based business as the stalker economy, which we don't like, he said. And so if I look at opinion polls, I see that Americans don't like to be snooped on, whether by government nor by big corporate, same like Europeans. I would say the core challenge is a democratic challenge. Namely, can there be freedom in a democracy if there's a place, a room, or a computer, a cloud, where everything about us is collected? Is freedom still possible under the conditions of total private surveillance? And once there's private surveillance, don't kid yourself. There's also public surveillance. I mean, I've been the Snowden investigator of the European Commission. I can tell you a lot about fusion centers and so on. So I think in the next mandate of the European Commission already, there will be a discussion about a very simple question. Is total profiling of people, and now I'm not talking about the playlist on Spotify, but total profiling of everything people do by Alphabet, by Facebook, and the secondary providers of profiling behind it, ad business. Is that compatible with democracy? My answer, absolutely not. Because by principle, in a free society, the means of communication must be free of surveillance, whether they are bilateral or multilateral. So, what does this mean? I just need a very short law which says total profiling forbidden. What happens then? Business model of advertisement changes from targeted advertising based on personal profiling to context-based advertisement. Back to the good old context-based advertisement. Is that as profitable? Is the conversion rate, getting people to buy something, as good as in targeted advertisement? That's where the different industries start to quarrel. That's where we need more empirics. Of course, Google and Facebook and all the friends of targeting who have the big profiles say absolutely not. But context-based advertising is a growing business model. And the people who do it and make money with it, they say yes, absolutely. Also, I would say it's not the first and not the second and not the third priority of a democracy to maintain the advertisement business. We have other things to do. So I would say we need to talk about these things more. We must make it clear that in the end, in the long term, democracy cannot function with this total surveillance which is put in place in the name of advertisement, and we have to get rid of it. And that willingness, that political willingness, I'm sure it will grow in Europe quicker than in the US, but I don't think it's out of reach. Already in this parliament in Brussels, We have a grouping of members of parliament who have started to work on this. In the Commission, we're also starting to think about this. It would have many huge advantages, not only from the point of view of democracy, but also from the point of view of consumer protection. I mean, think about how much and in how many ways people are screwed because of profiling, because it shows all your weaknesses, your weak moments, your leanings, your weak meaning. So I mean, it's a huge it creates huge misallocations of resources, and some of our economists even say that it is a macroeconomic cost because everybody pays to these companies for targeted advertising based on profiling, which is in the end, it's a huge cost factor and it's ineffective also. It doesn't lead to a better allocation of resources. So I would say, yes, there is a world to get to Project Liberty's idea. I like the idea. And I think, we just have the guts. We have to have the guts to talk about it and to develop these ideas further. Research here is not only about empirics and facts. It's also about being normative and reshaping how we want to see the world in the future. That's also part of science. And I think in this technological world, this part of research, namely building theories how things should be, and by the way, also for making legislations, we must allow ourselves to think. Today, in the fast-moving technological world, you cannot build legislation anymore only based on yesterday's empirics. You have to build legislation for what you imagine could be possible with this new technological capability. If you forbid yourself to do this, and you only do, evidence-based policymaking snore, you're always behind the curve. Yeah? No, I mean, I'm saying this so clearly because, of course, this is very ideological. It is interested parties who have an ideology, hold the state back, and they come and say everything must be evidence-based, please only sectoral, because otherwise it doesn't fit the problem, no general legislation, yeah? Show us the problem so we can only do, product improvement legislation. I like to say in Germany, Stiftung Warentest legislation, democracy, only the repair shop for big tech? Absolutely not. Democracy can do more than just risk-based legislation. We shape our lives through democratic actions. So let's not be shoehorned by tech discourses into you can only do facts-based, risk-based legislation. Absolutely not.
Okay, I like you, Paul.
Respond to that. That's a provocation, Paul. And I want my fellow researchers to also respond. I think I take the spirit well of what you're saying. I don't particularly like your precise words. I do believe that in order to leapfrog in terms of anticipating what the world could look like, we cannot rely strictly on the facts we have today. But that said, and I don't think you're saying this, but I just want to be clear, I do think there's definitely a place for evidence-based policy. I think it's the combination that we need. If we over-rely on evidence-based approaches, then yes, we are stuck with a very narrow understanding of the technology and its impacts because we're asking the questions we've always asked. At the same time, I think about GDPR, which you seem to have something to do with. I suffered under GDPR as a social science researcher based in the United States. And I took umbrage briefly, but then I said, this is for the better, that we do reach this point. But what I thought when I looked at GDPR is it was written broadly enough, my view, that it allowed for the world to evolve, but it was based around core principles. And this is my other element I want to say. I think we need evidence-based, but we also need to talk about core principles. I think that's the combination that I'm most interested in, and so that we do have legislation that anticipates or allows for change, but then where the evidence base really matters is how is GDPR doing today? What difference has it made, and how can we make it better?
So GDPR, I think it's understood that there was an important economic cost, and not just for enterprises in the US, but of course, to start with in the EU. And there is data showing now that the cost has been absorbed, it's actually generated new business models. So that's also interesting to notice and to respond to Michelle's initial question. In terms of how do we design regulation, I think it should be a combination of evidence-based and aspiration-based. Because if you always wait for the evidence, you're always going to be, a train behind. So it's got to be a bit of a mix, and it's never going to be perfectly comfortable. I think that's understood. And GDPR also shows that with time, well, actually, we're having a better harmonized, type of regulatory framework between the US and the EU. So it's painful at the beginning, but maybe in the medium long term, it's a benefit even for the US.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on now, I think, the three prior speakers and focus in a little bit on the question of the business models, because I think it's a very interesting provocation, this notion of banning surveillance advertising. I think one of the ways that that researchers and independent observers can help to shape that future is by doing the rigorous work to analyze what the potential replacement business models are that are viable in this incredibly interconnected economy that we have. So we don't want to ban surveillance advertising and end up with something worse. We want to end up with something better, which is more disaggregated and has better support for democratic principles through capitalism than what we have today. And I think that's an area that it requires more development and more work to be able to envision those scenarios. I think the same thing is true on the side of decentralization, and even getting back to Michelle's original question about the strength and the impact of the DMA. So when we were talking about the bigness is just being a large player enough to warrant this kind of intervention, I think one of the really significant sort of architectural aspects of the DMA is its focus specifically on the bottleneck power of the existing service providers, right? So it's one thing to be big and it's another thing to be a bottleneck, and not every large corporation is a bottleneck, but the ones that are identified as gatekeepers under the DMA have been identified that way for a reason, because you can only reach their users as a business on the other side by going through them, and because they leverage that power in order to shape the competitive landscape around them. And that you see at every level of the stack of the internet. You see it at the mobile device level, at the operating system level, at the browser level, at the search engine level, at the social media level. Maybe you see it at the messaging level too. That's something that I work on a lot, and I'm not exactly even sure how that ended up in there, but it's there nevertheless. And so there's a variety of tools that you can use to address these bottlenecks, and the DMA and other existing competition law address them in different ways. But the one which, to me, as an old school internet person, is so salient is interoperability, both vertical and horizontal. And so when we start to say there needs to be more interoperability, and the interfaces at each of those layers need to be defined neutrally so that competitors have equal access as to what the gatekeeper has, that automatically creates the question of what will the business models be of those competitors? If you create new interfaces, how will these competitors be able to stay in business and compete with these gatekeepers that have a historical advantage because they've been amassing leverage through data and through network effects and through other means? And that's another place where we could really use a lot more forward-thinking sort of visioning around what are the business models that are going to support this. And that goes beyond the context of the DMA to, like, if we wanted to unbundle social media and have competition at different parts of the ecosystem, not just on a monolith by monolith basis, but if we want to have more decentralized or federated systems, what are the mechanisms that are consistent with the existing incentives of capitalism that can be put in place to see a vibrant ecosystem of competitors. And to me, that is like a very fundamental charge. If we want to continue to support democracy through these networked means, we have to be able to answer those questions because we need democracy and capitalism to coexist.
I think that's a good answer. Beatrice, do you want to, I know you had some thoughts also.
I had some thoughts before, I guess. Yeah, this is super interesting to listen to. I actually wanted to have two reactions, I think. One is that there was an interesting debate last week on the internet on policymaking and evidence-based policymaking, because this economist at Virginia University wrote a piece called, that's why I looked at my phone, Cause and Effect and the Structure of the Social World. And basically, and it's interesting, she published it in a law review and not in an economy journal, most likely because an economy journal wouldn't have published that. But she wrote about how this emphasis in policymaking, ultimately with impact assessments and random trials and so on, leads to very little policy that can be transferred from one place of learning to another one, and oftentimes backtracks in the long run. So she was saying this way of making policy that's actually very, very interesting, it doesn't lead to structural change, and maybe we need structural change, and this is the way of doing that. And there was a back and forth, there was even a symposium gathered around that question, where people kind of balance this question, and for me, listening to you, but also based on what I had read before, there seems to be like this challenge about also not wanting to jump to the vacuum, right? And I think one of the interesting things that places Europe in a very good place to do this kind of thing is that it is still a major power that has kind of leverage and space to be risky, the way the US also could be able to withstand that if you think about other countries in the world, or even maybe countries by themselves in the EU, you have less of that space. So there's also something about who you are in the geopolitical context when you're trying to do this type of regulatory intervention. But then the other thing that I wanted to say, which is related, I hope, is that this I might have learned from reading Paul's book, now that we're quoting each other. Nice. And so the conditions for democracy are actually outside of social media. And social media is something that's in the spotlight because we are a little stressed about it and it's everywhere. But the conditions for democracy in Europe comes from a long-standing commitment to fundamental rights, to social security, to retirement, to a freedom of expression regime that is very different and limited, more than the freedom of speech in the United States. And there's a lot of very interesting scholarship about how you can have varieties of democracy and varieties of capitalism and how they go together. And those structures shape a little bit how technology is developed, but also how it spreads in society. So it is not surprising that these platforms of speech with a marketplace approach come from the United States because the conditions are different. I think that what that leads me to think is sometimes to be a little bit cautious about how much we are throwing at these platforms when we talk about democracy. And for example, when we talk about democracy in the US, yes, maybe it's a little bit about social media, but there's other challenges that should be addressed to facilitate a more, I think, civil or healthier democracy. And I think the same is maybe true in Europe, right? But technology also, this is what people like me who are scholars call, isn't exogenous nor endogenous, but it's also not neutral. What we mean by that is that the affordances and the capabilities that these technologies enable are there and they have actual effects. And so what I wonder about with this profiling conversation is that it's very hard that they won't do it, and it's very hard that this won't be done once you have all this data out there. So I agree with the law that says no profiling, but actually to the extent that we are opening up data for researchers and civil society, but you can also just scrape data. It's not, or you have a lot of data breaches, and a lot of our data is out there in the dark web available. You will still have these profiling capabilities enabled, I think, and that's something that I worry about, how we're gonna deal with those affordances that I think are new and are challenging. but again, and then maybe just going back to your point on data as property, that's the typical type of thing that I think works far less in Europe. And I was kind of surprised, Paul, that you liked it, because I think it speaks to a model of democracy where you understand voters or consumers to be voting with their feet, and so you would vote, you would choose where you live based on policies, and you will also choose your platform based on policies. But that's a very individualistic approach. And it seems to me that this challenge is not one that we can solve with disorganized or like emerging collective action, which has led to several inequalities in the US, if I may say that, but seems to warrant systemic approaches, which is, I think, the one we're more like discussing here.
That makes sense to me, actually. And you can say that about the US. I think that's fair, at least from my perspective. So one question, or so the question of, let's move into AI, because I think speaking about, somehow banning surveillance profiling would directly impact the creation of these AI models. So it's one of my questions is maybe for Alyssa, how big of a fight do you think they would give against that, right? Let's, Alyssa worked for Cisco, and not to call you out, but, whatever. So, and I worked as a privacy advocate for a long time, so I know just how intense, and I'm sure you all know too, the lobbying can be and the resources behind the lobbying that these companies have. So it's almost, I can almost not imagine how much they would fight against something like this, not to mention the fact that they own all the models, right, already. So I'm just wondering, so let's move into two questions, I guess. One is, how would that work in the context of the now, which is that these companies already own most of the models? And two, how do we, what can we use from this discussion and also DSA, DMA, moving forward in terms of how US and EU regulators should approach, what can they take from those two laws when they're approaching regulation to AI?
So I think the first thing to remember, I'm going to broaden out a little bit from your very specific question of how would they respond, but
Okay.
I think the first thing to always come back to when thinking about this AI policy space is how much is not different from the discussions that we've had before. Have we ever talked about privacy and data protection in depth? Only for 25 years, right? Have we ever talked about transparency? Oh, have never heard of it, right? Autonomy vis-a-vis automated and computerized systems. There's probably 60 years of policy debate about human-machine interfaces, and do we lose some of our own autonomy and dignity when computers start making decisions about us, regardless of whether they are deterministic or non-deterministic decisions, right? So I think it's really easy to fall prey to this, like, the shiny object phenomenon, where it's like, it's this new thing and nobody understands it, and the people who build the models don't even understand them, and therefore we have to take this, like, wholly new approach, right? I think that is misguided, and we should instead draw on all these bodies of policy and understanding of prior iterations of very similar technologies and apply them at will as much as we possibly can. And when we cull it down to what is actually new here and what the real differences are, you already see all of the parties, I think, kind of lining up with their own arguments around those questions, right? So there is one set of actors who wants to say that what is new here is that this technology could destroy all of humanity tomorrow, right? So that's like a novel argument that you didn't have about the mainframe computers that were originally developed, right? Or maybe you did. I could be wrong about that. So I think it's worth kind of getting down to brass tacks about, like, what are those salient differences. I do think the lack of explainability insofar as, like, those who are creating some of these models really fundamentally do not understand particular aspects of how they work, and the threat that creates to everybody whose lives are touched by them, I think that's new. And there's, there's potentially other aspects which are also new. But those are really the places, I think, to focus the AI policy discussion around. I think on the business side, I guess what I would say is, first of all, just personal opinion, like clearly in a bubble right now. I mean, the dollar figures that are being expended and that are thrown out as potential future expenditures, and the hype cycle and all of that, like it seems to have all the signatures of the last few tech bubbles that we've all lived through. And so that's just like important to recognize, and again, like ground the discussion, because the discussion should not be about massively overinflated hypotheticals that have very little chance of coming to fruition. But I do think, one, I think, even lesson so far from the DMA that can carry forward into the AI policy discussion is that the aspects which get to the very heart of the existing businesses of the large players are the ones where they will fight hardest, fight to the death. And so if you see this, if you look at even the existing investigations that were just opened into noncompliance under the DMA, they are targeting the aspects of each company's business that are most crucial to their future success, right? So if you look at the Google noncompliance, it's like it's self-preferencing in search, because this is like where they make all their money, right? Whereas they're more apt to be compliant with some of the other measures. And so again, if we transport that into the AI context and you look at how does Microsoft make its money? How does Google make its money? Where's the big potential future opportunity? Then I think that kind of directs your attention towards where they will fight the most. I will say, just again, coming from Cisco, which is more of an enterprise-focused technology provider, there is huge opportunity on the enterprise side of this technology. Like, it is undeniable. There's so much data locked up inside of enterprises that with tailored, customized models could be exploited in, I think, many beneficial and efficient ways. And that's just like almost completely absent from the policy debate, because it's so focused on the consumer-facing aspects, and everyone is obsessed with the fact that a chatbot appears to respond to you like a human. But I think in terms of the business value, it's likely to be majority on the enterprise side. And that's, I think, just worth remembering that is also what is driving many of the companies in the space.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think also that it's useful to focus, let's say, on the potential positives of AI, independent of DMA and DSA. I must say, I joined Beatrice a little bit, when we think about democracy and other important good things in the world, it will not all be mainly even technology. I mean, democracy is really many other issues. But let's take AI and the potentials. For example, can we use AI to reconstitute a public space which is constitutive and which works for democracy? For example, we now have in Brussels this new Council for the European Public Space, which says, well, let's build a TV platform which brings together all TV news created by licensed TV stations in Europe. We have a lot of them, even publicly financed. I mean, we spend around 30 billion a year on public TV in Europe, in all member states, but we can't see all this content because it's all in the foreign languages. So platform, bring it all together, make it searchable, automatic translation, and with a very low investment, low-hanging fruit, we make available all this fantastic news content and political documentaries to all people in all member states, so that the Hungarians can see in Hungarian what the news is about Hungary, and it's not controlled by the Hungarian TV stations. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Let's see whether tech will deliver this. Yeah? I give you another example. Enterprise, pharmaceuticals. Do we still want to torture the poor swines, or can we, with AI, simulate the biology of the swine? It seems no. The answer seems to be, because I'm being often overwhelmed by we need to make pharmaceutical research more easy, and we don't find people who are ready to hold the animals because the poor animals and the legislation and this and that. And I say, yeah, but AI will solve it for you. Absolutely not. We don't even know 10% of the biology of the swine. So I'm saying, you said in a side sentence, oh God, you know, if there's no personal profiling, we can't train AI anymore. There are a lot of opportunities for AI, which have, and the majority of money-making opportunities with AI have nothing to do with personal data, absolutely not. Latest GPT, Chat GPT, yeah? It's about content, literary content. It's not about personal data in the first place. But, of course, structuring this whole environment in a way which maintains existing rights and, you know, also which shapes society in a way we want, of course will not go without fight. I mean, you know, we can never have fear of, oh God, you know, Google is going to close down its European search operations if we don't allow, if we introduce a right to be forgotten. You know, we will close everything here, or Facebook, you know, I mean, all these threats. Come on. I mean, you know, let's not be impressed by them. Democracy can never be blackmailed. We should never have fear of the opposition of these concentrated parties to a political project in which we believe. Any good political project of the European Union at the outset had huge opposition. You know, this morning we heard about Jacques Delors' internal market. I mean, what do you think? So I don't think that that should be a consideration. You know, we have fought down the chemical industry. We fought. I remember when we introduced the rules that transfers between accounts in Europe should cost as much as domestic accounts. The argument was, seriously, all banks will go bankrupt. You know, you're doing huge damage to Europe and so on. Complete bullshit. Yeah. And of course it was passed by the legislator because a legislator feels that it's bullshit. Yeah. So I mean, my lessons, my very sad lesson from 30 years of Brussels is business lies. Don't believe what they say. They lie systematically in the political process. And this is also one of my future projects of the future. You see, the irony is in competition law, if they lie to us in enforcement, we can impose a fine. See, WhatsApp, Facebook case, 110 million fine for not telling the true story. If they lie in the legislative procedure before the parliament, can't do anything. Is that conducive to democracy? Absolutely not. So I would join those who say, A, research. Don't only focus on constraining big tech, focus also on making AI useful for democracy and other purposes. That could be a part of the solution of the problem. And the second is also always look at the relative importance of big tech issues in the democratic debate. It may well be, you know, like the app didn't solve the problem of COVID, it was the behavioral rules and it was the vaccine. You know, you have to see the things in context. And maybe we as friends of tech, we try to overestimate the importance, or we tend to overestimate the importance of tech. And maybe if we invest into other things, like for example, this TV platform, and for example, keeping our press alive, whether there's a business model or not, you know, it makes more sense. I mean, I'm of the deep conviction, democracy needs a fourth estate which functions well. We need independent journalists, they have to be well paid, and. And if we come to the conclusion there is no business model which makes this possible, well, the answer will not be then we won't have it anymore. The answer will be then we must have it publicly financed. And is that of the devil? Yes, if you're neoliberal, but not if you're a normal European. I mean, as I said, on public TV we spend 30 billion a year, and we have member states who also finance their printed press. It's not of the devil. I mean, we can afford it, and we should.
Okay. So we're going to take some questions in just a minute. I just want to see if anyone has reaction or comment on that. Okay, great. So we have time for your questions. I assume there's many.
I have a question about business model, not just of media, but indeed of big tech. You talked a lot about how it's an ads business, and it's very hard to argue. And the question is, if we can move to subscription model, there is a lot of talk about this. You didn't have time to discuss that. In principle, we can imagine that we can tax digital advertising, given that we tax alcohol, we tax cigarettes, digital media, like we can call them social media, but they are ads businesses. are addictive. There are problems with mental health of kids. So there is a reason to assume that there is a negative externality, not even talking about disinformation, damage to democracy, but just based on addiction and mental health problems, that's enough to make a case for tax on digital advertising and move them to subscription. We have streaming platforms which have subscription model. We have ChatGPT and some AI models which actually use subscription rather than advertising. Recently, it's now a debate in Google that for Google, actually, the AI search is not going to work in a traditional way. They will use non-AI search model in an ads business model. So the question is, will subscription actually work given the addictive nature of the business? So Twitter, we all criticize Elon Musk for all kinds of reasons, but he tries to move to subscription model. Nobody wants to pay whatever, $8 or $10 per month. Facebook, since November in Europe, introduced a model where you pay whatever, $13, 13 euros per month, and you have no ads. I'm sure that nobody in the room has accepted this wonderful proposition, right? So you're not in Europe, chap. You're not allowed. You don't have access to this wonderful service. So do you think there is a future for a subscription model for social media?
Yeah, short answer, yes. If the New York Times would start as a social network where at the same time you get the exclusive content of the New York Times, I think for publishers, there would be such a future, especially if we have interoperability rules, which allow people to get into this, to communicate across the networks, but you only get the exclusive content if you have subscribed. If yeah. The
question is, why I not subscribe to Twitter and Facebook?
Well, that's my argument. I think for publishers, probably there could be a business model of a social network combined with exclusive content. But let's say we would have to do legislation which makes this viable. I think there are legislative conditions which need to be created for this.
That's interesting. We wrote a report for the European Parliament on social media and democracy, and we had this like media pluralism part of it. And it is true that we subscribe to, I'm not subscribed to the Financial Times, but Sciences Po pays it for me. But we subscribe to some news outlets. But one of the still concerning things about those dynamics is that it is really mainly the main media and the largest players who are benefiting from our willingness to pay. So you still see a very concerning democratic pattern where I would actually go with Paul's proposal to subsidize the media, where smaller newspapers are really struggling financially. And even you see actors like, not necessarily the New York Times because they moved out of that, but big actors like Le Monde or the BBC or so on, they rely importantly on social media for viewers and clicks and attractiveness. And there's ways in which maybe you've experienced this. If you go on Instagram or TikTok, the New York Times, Le Monde, and they will be catering for content that is interesting for youth because they are betting that 5 years from now, if you know their brand, you will pay. So there's like some subsidizing happening there, but you have small media struggling, and small media is very, very important for democratic engagement. It's where people find out that someone died, what your local politician is doing, and so there's a big conversation there. So I don't think we are totally willing to pay for the media that we should be also paying for. And there's good reasons for that. It's very hard to pay for 4 or 5 newspapers, especially in a global economy. One of the challenges of paying for social media, I think, is that we started being used for it, that it's for free. So I think the fact that the expectations need to change is very hard as a consumer. But also the availability of the free alternative is very hard on us as consumers. And then also, what is the value that we're getting from social media? Even though I spend too much time on social media, and I think I get a lot from it, while also too many things that I shouldn't be getting. it's clear. So for example, LinkedIn is a very interesting example of a social media for work where you have a successful model of subscriptions because LinkedIn offers services attached to the paid model where it's if you're looking for a job, it's very useful to be on LinkedIn in the paid version. You will get to do a lot of things. You'll have added features. So that's interesting. I think that's less the case of how we relate to things like Twitter or TikTok or Instagram. So there's something about the interfaces and the models that makes it hard. I would be interested what you think about messaging. Because WhatsApp, for example, is an infrastructure on which I think a lot of the world runs. And I have it for free, but I don't know if you think we would be able to pay for it, or we would pay for it.
Its main benefit is that it's free. It replaced SMS, which was so expensive. I mean, that's why it's so popular, right? It's like an amazing success, in particular in Europe, right? Because sending SMS across borders was prohibitively expensive, and WhatsApp came and said, oh, we can do the same thing for free. Look at this, and you can connect with everybody, and suddenly they have 3 billion users. So that one I think is tricky if you want to reintroduce messaging fees, but it's a good tee up for what I was going to say, which is I think there's sort of two things that come out of what you said. One is just like, yeah, the behavioral economics implications of the change from something you used to get for free to something which is paid are significant, right? And it's probably something where there's already been a lot of research, but where you could have, I think that's a great candidate for like, how do we translate this into good options for policymakers, being cognizant of the fact that people have all these existing biases based on the services they've been able to obtain for free in the past. The other one, though, I think, and I think the change to Meta in Europe is a good example of this, is to think about like what is really the value exchange, right? So, and how does that affect the network effects of these systems? So, you can pay 13 euros or potentially 6 or whatever it's going to be now to get Facebook in Europe without ads. Well, how valuable is that to people? What if you could get Facebook without hate speech? What if you could get it without annoying aunts and uncles? You know, what if you, there's like many different potential value propositions for what you do and don't get from social media that could be monetized in different ways through, you know, different kinds of subscriptions. And it's the same on the advertising side too, right? But they already have built a lot of business models on the advertising side. So I think that's like really the interesting space to explore is like, if you want people to start to pay for something on a monthly basis, what are they really paying? Would I pay more for ChatGPT if it never hallucinated? Would you? I would definitely pay more for it if it never hallucinated, right? So, so there's a whole like quality and user experience dimension to this, which I think, again, we cannot rely on the companies who are who've made trillions of dollars on their existing business model to be super creative about those things, and that's why opening the markets is so important. But as we do that, we have to also allow that creativity to flourish in the design of the business models.
I want to add something super quick, which is something that you said that I thought was very interesting, is that one of the interesting parts of that question is that we are relying on what social media tells us about their business model. And I think, Paul, you hinted at this earlier, you could potentially have a model where social media companies are no longer allowed to do profile-based advertising and do context-based advertising, and they're still quite profitable because in the research that I know, and I might be wrong, or people here might know more than me, we don't really know how much profile advertising, how good it is. Like, is it that good? In part because a lot of the work that I've seen and makes this critique relies on the data that social media companies give us. But that is the same data they are giving to the people they're trying to sell their business to. So of course Facebook is gonna say that it can hypnotize me and send me to someone's restaurant, because that's kind of what they're after from a business perspective. But I think that's one of the instances of the potential of better understanding these ecosystems. It's also being able to understand their business model and be able to propose alternatives. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'll just throw in perhaps from the French perspective that the day they decided that advertisement should be prohibited on certain television channels, the public ones, they had to throw in some public money, some subsidies. I mean, otherwise the business model just did not function. So maybe that's acceptable, maybe that's a democratic choice, but it has financial implications for sure.
Right, and I mean, I'm the son of a journalist, newspaper journalist, which was a very, how to say it, struggling industry for many years, even before there was a Google, because of what happened with advertising. I remember an ad in 1986, I'm old, which showed a large terminal, desk terminal, and saying, don't trust the computer, trust your local newspaper to tell you where your customers are. I mean, advertising has been part of how news has been distributed for a long time. So that's something worth considering. The couple things I would say, one, I can tell you, and I imagine everyone who thinks about it would imagine this is the truth, that this price you can pay in Europe to not have ads is based on research. And it's probably actually lower than what you'd be willing to pay because they want it to work. So there is a way of thinking about the economics of this and what the value is of ads or not ads. And to Alyssa's point, all these other elements could be monetized, which is really what it's ultimately about for the business. What can you monetize? In the absence of profiling, what happened at Meta, they recovered when they were restricted on what they could advertise. I mean, with Apple. Apple were limiting their ability to automatically be able to, put ads on, targeted ads on iPhones, for example. That was a huge blow to Meta. But they recovered because they can figure out how to deal with these issues. So you don't necessarily need the profiling to be profitable, to your point, right? So I think it is a really good question. What could the business model be? What are different sources of income for a company? But I think, again, from the perspective of where I sit now at Project Liberty, what could be more focused on the individual consumer and their rights, not just to quality products, but actually, again, choice. And granted, most likely the value of any one individual's data that is available, even their network effects, might not turn into millions of dollars, but there is a way in which the default could be that you just don't give that away for nothing, that there is a transaction that you have value in this digital economy too, because it is about being networked at the end of the day.
Giving users data rights can be an interesting policy choice. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, thank you very much for your... We have a mic. No problem.
So in this kind of European and transatlantic attempt at digital regulation, what do you make of all of these like Russian social media platforms such as Vkontakte, Telegram, that pretty much all European citizens can access, and where you can find hate speech, you can find fake news, you can find a lot of things that should be illegal in the EU. How can we like counteract this? And isn't it kind of ignoring an elephant in the room to try to regulate mainstream platforms in Europe, but also kind of ignore the Russian ones that are still accessible?
Go ahead. Let's take that.
Well, I'm not sure the Russian platforms are the big problem. I mean, one of the challenges also under the DSA is that, of course, Facebook is making money on Russian propaganda. Because the more extreme it is, the more it gets clicks, the more you have, you can place advertisement next to it. So the more people get excited, the more extreme messages are, and many of them are produced by Russians, paid by the government. The more this advertisement model actually profits from it. So I think that is our biggest challenge. Then the platforms. I mean, we ban, and licenses have been revoked of the TV stations, the Russian RT, and so on. I think that's the easier part. The more difficult part is to incite the platforms also to take themselves responsibility and sort this problem out. And there one has to be honest. I mean, the DSA is a halfway compromise because of the majorities which we have, which are politically what they are, as we heard this morning, grand coalition, liberals, conservatives, social democrats, and Greens. In such a coalition, you don't get a DSA which just says we apply media law to the platforms, which would mean that on every single piece of what is put on there, they have an own initiative responsibility. But you get a DSA, which we have now, which is sort of, halfway, just a structural responsibility, and we will audit you, and then we will see wishy-washy. So, is the expectation that the DSA solves all problems of democracy, fake news, and so on? Obviously not. It is a part of the equation. It's part of a bigger mosaic, which includes many other measures. I mean, obviously we spend a lot of money, for example, on what is called Stratcom, strategic communication. We have here, we dole out money to fact checkers all over the place. We dole out money to organizations which put the social networks on notice, of content. And all of this, you always have to see this as measures which are half-hearted, because the political majorities are not such that if you come with something which is, really solving the problem, you get the majority. So, this is what democracy is about. I mean, from a scientific point of view, all these things are rotten compromises, some may say. I would say they are progress to the status quo before. In the end, in a world of free speech, there can never be a perfect solution. I mean, let's also be careful a little bit for what we wish for. So, if we come too close to, perfect management of the public space and opinions and so on, better stay a little bit away from that.
No, that's great. So we could end there, or does anyone else have any final words? No? Yes, let's not get too close to perfect, I think is a good way to end it. So thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this great discussion today. And thanks, everyone, for your attention.